Hello everybody, my name is Tony Mortimer. This talk is based on Nagarjuna, an ancient sage, approximately 200 AD. He is often referred to as the second Buddha. I have also compiled a comprehensive book on Nagarjuna's teachings. An abbreviated version of this book, or excerpts, can be viewed by Googling my blog, Buddhist, Non-Duality, Melbourne, Nagarjuna. I can also be reached by email, tonymortimer15@yahoo.com.au. That's TONYMORTIMER15@yahoo.com.au, all lowercase. So let us get straight into it. The message should speak for itself. The philosophy of the Buddha rests on three simple observations. He observed all things are impermanent. People are dissatisfied with impermanent or transient things. And there is no permanent self in people. Since the body-mind aggregates are impermanent, there certainly cannot be a permanent self abiding within them. Thus far, the Buddha's analysis that characterises the human condition: impermanence, dissatisfaction, and no self. This is the enlightened perspective. But one who does not perceive these facts will believe that things are permanent or real, that it is possible to find satisfaction in these things, and that there is an enduring self in people. According to the Buddha, this is the unenlightened perspective and is the root cause of all suffering. Suffering, he says, is occasioned by grasping at things, be it the thirst for the pleasant or aversion to the unpleasant. This grasping or desiring, having mere transitory things as its object, will always be frustrated because it can never be satisfied by transitory things. Like addicts, we are compelled to pursue things without freedom to do otherwise. Undertaking this or that activity in pursuit of the appearing phenomena, shrinking from the unpleasant and grasping after the pleasant. The pain of birth and the terror of death, the frustration of growing old and feeble that causes us great suffering. Even the pleasant things in life are grasped after with an unwarranted desire which overestimates the pleasure they will give and is accompanied by a constant fear of their loss. The Buddha points out the painful and sad futility of our clinging to things that simply cannot be held no matter how tightly they are grasped. With no essential nature, neither our own selves nor the things around us have any inner handle by which we can grab and hold them. The doctrine of emptiness, Nagarjuna's doctrine, can help eradicate suffering that comes from grasping at what are but mere empty appearances, because it teaches us that there is really nothing to be possessed. Since everything is inherently empty, like empty reflections in a mirror, nothing can be truly grasped. Our continuous and unceasing attempts to satisfy our hunger by acquiring the objects of our desires are doomed to failure from the very onset. The objects do not possess within themselves properties that will satisfy our desire, so the desire will, sooner or later, be frustrated. Our frustration arises from and feeds our grasping, and in this way we unwittingly build a prison for ourselves brick by brick. When we see the world aright, which is the enlightened perspective, in that we no longer mistake what are but mere transient appearances to be substantial permanent entities, grasping at things ceases. When grasping ceases, ignorance ceases, and hence suffering ceases. Thus far, we have touched on the Buddha's first two observations, impermanence and dissatisfaction. Let us investigate his third observation, no self. According to standard Buddhist doctrine, the subtlest, deepest and most dangerous false view held by humans is the belief in a permanent, independent self. Afraid of death and the possibility of our personal non-existence, we desperately impute and cling to a permanent, unchanging subject or self that is always there. So let us investigate and see if we can find such a self. For example, if a self exists, then we should be able to find it within either our body or our mind. We have to analyse each part to find where the sense of self comes from. You should investigate from the hair of your head down to your toes, whether or not any particular part of your body is the self. Could the self be the head, the legs, the torso, the skin, the heart, the brain, and so on? None of these body part candidates could be said to be an identical match with the self. Perhaps then the self is the mind, such as feelings, thoughts, perceptions, and cognition. But these are always changing, and the self is not meant to change. Likewise, the self cannot be our awareness or consciousness, because they are constantly changing like our mind. And the self cannot be the combination of its body-mind parts, because if we separate it off the body-mind, we should be left with the self. But this is not the case. We can only conclude that such a self simply cannot be found. So the Buddha in his teaching has burst the bubble and demonstrated that there was really no me, no self, no real point that was a centre. And he taught the teaching of no self. And he stated it in no confusing terms. He stated very clearly no self over and over again. There is no self to be found in this body and mind of any form or any shape, either in it or out of it anywhere. No self, full stop. But no self does not mean nothing, non-existence, no personality. Of course you are there, the person sitting there. There are perceptions, feelings, personality traits, physical parts such as hands, legs and heart, but no self. However, this is not to be accepted through belief, but is to be realised through careful investigation and contemplation. It is a well-kept secret. The signs are not easy to read. The conditioning is so strong. We have been taught over and over again that there is a real you and that it is within you. You believe it whether you understand it or not. However, we are fortunate that we have the seeds. The seeds are being planted in our minds through the Buddhist teachings. Maybe, actually, there is nobody there. Nobody at home at all. So you can't forget that now. Since everything is impermanent, the Buddha concluded that there cannot be a permanent self abiding in people. What we take to be a person or self, according to the Buddha, is simply the body-mind aggregates arising and ceasing. The idea of a person is just a convenient way to refer to these five categories and aggregates of elements. It is dispositions and grasping that causes one to see an illusory self in the aggregates. Yet when examined, nowhere would there be found an organ or entity, as it were, which was an actual I or ego or self in this dynamic agglomeration of fluctuating elements. Thus, he concluded, beings are empty of a self or selfless. Now, the Buddha did not say that there was no appearance or experience of a self, but rather that there was no actual person that can be found to act as a referent for the concept of self. It is clear that we all use the label self, and we all experience the self as an apparent subject of our experiences. But the Buddha showed that when we look for a substance or essence that underlies the aggregates, no actual entity of a self can be found that corresponds to that experience of self. No matter where one looks within the body-mind aggregates, no actual self is to be found. Not finding such a self is in fact the key to liberation or enlightenment. And that brings us to our next topic, the last one in this segment, is enlightenment. Why are we not enlightened? In a nutshell, we have been seduced by the deceptive nature of appearances. We falsely perceive the mere appearance of things to be substantial, independent entities, which the Buddha discovered they are not. He undermined the notion of such substantial, independent entities by demonstrating that all things depend for their existence on other things. Like a tree depends for its existence on leaves, branches, a trunk, soil, water, and so on. Or a person depends for his or her existence on parents, the body-mind aggregates, food, and so on. Since all things are dependently arisen, then they are not arisen independently on their own. If not arisen on their own, then they cannot be said to exist on their own. Dependent origination states that no thing exists apart from its relationship with other things. There is no thing which is or exists independently. What this amounts to is that no thing exists by itself or through its own accord, and that is not dependent on other things for its existence. What this amounts to is that things lack a permanent or individual self-nature or essence. The key word is lack. Since things depend for their existence on other things, they lack their own independent self-nature. Recognition of this lack of self-nature or lack of essence in things, the Buddha says, is precisely what enlightenment is. Enlightenment is like realising that something we are looking for, our car keys, are not there in their usual spot, the top drawer, and right then directly perceiving the lack of our car keys. An awareness of this lack is referred to as the perception of emptiness. Emptiness is what the Buddha is famous for. Enlightenment is thus not the finding of something. It is the insight that such a thing simply cannot be found. In other words, enlightenment is not in finding, but rather not finding. For example, when we look for something substantial, something tangible, something independent that is representative of that thing, such as treeness, as in a tree, or selfness, as in a person, it simply cannot be found. The true nature is not the thing's seeming substantial existence, its appearance, but rather its lack or emptiness of such existence. In fact, the true nature of things, which is the ultimate nature of things, is that they are but mere appearances. They are nothing more than that, like empty reflections in a mirror. The Buddha makes the argument that everything arises dependently without attaining its own nature, thingness, or essence. So all talk of independent fixed entities, essence, beingness, or self-nature must be abandoned. A radical conclusion indeed. Without independent fixed nature, change is possible. Change is precisely why people live, die, suffer, and can be enlightened and liberated. And change, including the transformations which lead to enlightenment, is only possible if entities and the way in which we conceptualise them are void or empty of any eternal, fixed and immutable essence. The Buddha himself was only transformed or changed because of emptiness or the lack of any fixed nature. Change is the key. Change is at work every moment on everything. In other words, there is no static moment for anything. That things appear to change shows that those things are not permanent, freestanding entities. If there were such a self-reliant thing, it would be impervious to effect upon it. It would be eternal, frozen, and unconnected to anything. It would remain as it had presumably been created, indefinitely, immortally. We would be trapped eternally with no avenue of escape. But this is not the case. Change is at hand. Ignorance is beginning to wane. If we are feeling disappointed, depressed, or anxious, recognise it is impermanent and is thus subject to change. so it will soon pass. Knowing this, we won't be deceived by our senses. To see the deception is to be free of deception.